gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions, the fortnightly podcast that brings you twisted tales of the uncanny and awful, performed by voice artist Kristen Holland. So, how are you, gentle listener? In a good mood? Feeling chipper? You are? Oh dear. Well, we can fix that. Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present Heaven Unearthed by Rory Say. The head was coarse and misshapen. Benjamin's knees were planted in the dirt as he held it, thinking it looked like one of the potatoes his mother would rip from the ground before she'd peel its skin. They were different shapes, the potatoes, and the head looked like the longer, thinner kind, not like the ones that were scrunched and lumpy. It was about the size of one, too. But the weight of it, or weightlessness, made it feel as though he held nothing at all. Benjamin had been digging in the back garden early in the morning when he came across the head. His mother had sectioned off part of the garden just for him and given him his own spade. He never knew what he was digging for, had never thought about it, but he liked to do it. Sometimes he found tiny white bones or bits of colourful gravel that he collected in glass jars. But he had never found anything like the head he now held in his hands. He didn't know it was a head at first. When his spade hit the solid rock, the impact startled him. He looked into the hole he was making and saw the greyness exposed in the black dirt. Throwing his spade aside, he sank to his knees and poured away the surrounding earth, then wrenched the stone free. It was only when he began to scrape away the encrusted dirt with his fingers that he saw the face. The features were crude but unmistakable, no more than slits in the grey stone. Nor did they seem to be etched, but rather a natural anomaly in the rock. The eyes were thin and slightly diagonal, the mouth a short, straight line, no nose. As he looked at it, he felt that the thing he held somehow beheld him as well. And the longer he studied it, the more the feeling amplified, a feeling that wasn't fear so much as self-consciousness, like the way he felt when older people watched him, unaware that he knew they were watching. A chill passed through him, gently rattling his bones. As he knelt there in the dirt with the rock in his hand, a vague sense of shame formed inside him, as though he had knowingly done something his mother would disapprove of, seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Benjamin stood up and put the head in a jacket pocket, picked up his spade and began to walk purposefully back toward the house. Halfway there he stopped suddenly, as if an invisible barrier prevented his progress. Then he turned around. With slow, careful steps he walked back to the hole and stood over it, looking in. It was about 2 feet deep and a foot round. Benjamin took the head out of his pocket, avoided it with his eyes, and dropped it back in the hole. It barely made a sound as it landed, face up, in the dirt. He dug his shovel into the mound beside the hole and flung a spadeful of dirt into the small pit. Repeated, again and again. The head disappeared as Benjamin continued filling the hole, disappeared back into the ground. When the mound was gone and the hole filled, he patted the earth down with his spade, then stomped back and forth over the spot. For a quiet moment he stood atop the filled hole, Still feeling the knot in his stomach, the pulse in his temples, he looked around the garden. He considered digging elsewhere, digging for bones or for bugs, but he was suddenly wary of what he might find buried beneath him. Benjamin walked back to the house, less resolute than before, his head bent downward, limp arm dragging the shovel behind him. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. Margaret was just beginning her morning rosary at the kitchen table when she heard her son come in from outside. She halted her whispered prayer and listened to Benjamin scrape his shoes on the front mat before closing the door behind him. "Are you hungry, love?" she called. "No." "And what treasures did you find today?" "Nothing." A moment later he appeared, looking like a miniature workman as he trudged into the kitchen carrying his shovel over a shoulder. His forearms were covered in dirt, and even his face was smeared from when he'd shoved hair out of his eyes with a blackened hand. Margaret looked him over. "Shoes, Benjamin!" she scolded. Benjamin looked down at his caked boots. "Sorry, Mum." He turned around and walked back to the front door, leaving a second trail of boot prints in his wake. Margaret only smiled to herself and picked up her beads. "Come on back and help me with the rosary," she called after him. "Let's see if you remember it now." A groan answered her from the other room. She remembered being his age, when prayer was just another chore. Still, she was hurt by his disinterest. She'd given him his father's old rosary beads on his last birthday, and the disappointment in his face made her heart sick. They sat unused beside his bed. She wished that just once she'd hear him at it without having to be told or pleaded with. Benjamin sulked back into the kitchen, wiped his hands on a wet rag, and sat at the table across from his mother. Margaret held out the rosary beads and placed the wooden cross in his hands. He held it to his forehead and then moved it mechanically to his chest, left shoulder, then right, uttering the sign of the cross as he did so. Margaret mirrored him. Then his fingers moved to the first bead. His voice was brittle as he began to recite the Apostles' Creed, fumbling over the words, trying to get them out too quickly, trying to get it over with. "Slow down, love," Margaret interrupted. "There's no rush. Start over, slowly this time." Benjamin squeezed his eyes shut and sighed. Then he began again, slowly. Partway through, his voice grew weaker. "Was crucified, died, and was. His words wavered, stopped. "You know it, Benjamin. Come on now." "Was crucified, died, and was buried," Benjamin continued, his voice distant, almost frightened sounding. "He descended to the dead. On the third day he rose again. He ascended into heaven." Margaret wasn't listening to his words anymore. They kept coming out, but it was clear his mind was elsewhere, probably still out in the garden. It was his face which drew her attention now, the way his eyes kept cutting to the window, and how his lips trembled between words. Soon his voice faltered again, and he fell silent. "You can finish in your room if you like," said Margaret. "I know you don't like being looked over, but it's not a test, you know." "I know." Benjamin slid off his chair and made for his bedroom. Margaret called his name as he went, not really knowing why, and when he turned around she thought she saw something like sadness in his eyes. "You're all right, aren't you? You're feeling okay?" Benjamin looked down at the ground and nodded shyly. "I'm okay, Mum," he said, and disappeared into his bedroom. Late that night, Benjamin lay wide awake in bed. He somehow wasn't sure if he had slept and woke suddenly or hadn't slept at all. It felt like he had dreamt about lying awake in bed for a long time. But he was sure he was awake now, not dreaming. Lying on his back, hands laced by the fingers and resting on his chest, he stared up at the ceiling. Moonlight filled the room through a curtainless window, and his eyes were well adjusted. He was thinking about it, out there, underneath the garden. And as he lay there, thinking, he felt like he was postponing something that was about to happen. In the next instant he was on his feet, blanket flung aside. He dressed in the partial darkness, pulling the same clothes over himself he had worn earlier that day. His shoes were by the front door, and he decided against fetching them. He didn't need them. He wouldn't be long. Holding his breath, he pushed against the window, opening it in one slow movement, praying it wouldn't creak. It didn't, and he quietly exhaled into the night. The spade, which he did need, was against the wall beside the window. He took it, sat down on the window's ledge, and shimmied over it on his backside. The night was silent and cloudless, neither warm nor cold. The soft ground felt good beneath his bare feet. Leaving the window open behind him, Benjamin took a few steps out into the garden and looked up at the night sky, awash with stars too numerous to fathom. His steps slowed and then stopped as he craned his neck higher, filling his field of vision with the impossible sky. Suddenly Benjamin felt weightless. He understood that he was a part of it, the immensity above him, around him, inside him. And though what he was looking at was more than he could ever imagine beholding with one pair of eyes, in that moment he knew what he saw to be the merest fraction of a pinprick of everything there was to be seen. And then the moment was gone. He felt his legs beneath him and wondered how long he'd been gazing at the numberless flickering stars and the sharp sliver of moon. And why? His eyes wandered down from the sky, and he realized he wasn't where he thought he was, but instead where he intended to be. He hadn't set any marker, but he knew the spot, and he knew this was it. He looked back to the house, a dark shape in the distance, and then down to the ground in front of him. Hovering the point of his spade over the cool earth at his feet, he measured where to strike, then sunk it, lifted, threw and sunk again. He worked methodically, driving his foot down on the spade and watching its blade disappear, lifting it back up and dropping the dirt carefully behind him. He wanted to dig faster, to get it over with, but he held himself back, forced himself to stay quiet and measure each movement. But he couldn't help his heart from growing more alive as he dug steadily, deeper and deeper. As soon as his spade hit the stone, he dropped to his knees, reached into the hole, and once again brought the head up from the earth. It wasn't so coated with dirt as it had been earlier. He brushed it clean with his fingers and held it up to the moonlight. Its features were barely visible, but they were there. 3 dark slits at the base of the elongated stone. A dull heat seemed to pulse inside of it, warming the palms of his hands. It was smoother than he remembered, too, as though a sleek membrane had encased the rough exterior. Benjamin clutched the head in one hand and his spade in the other as he quickly made his way back to the house and through the window. Nothing out of the ordinary in there. Dr. Mathers spoke through a bristly moustache, the colour of rusted steel. "You can close your mouth now, lad." Benjamin chomped his mouth shut while the doctor scribbled in a notebook. "Now, take your shirt off, would you, boy?" Margaret had called on Dr. Mathers just in case. No one could say she didn't have a right to be concerned, not after whatever it was that had swept her husband away half a year ago. And Benjamin looked worse this morning than he had yesterday. He barely touched the loaf of wheaten she'd baked, and from his drawn face you'd think he hadn't slept a wink. Of course he wasn't saying anything, but when did he ever? Her concern seemed justified when after breakfast Benjamin had neglected to take up his spade and head for the garden. Instead, he had slunk away from the table when her back was turned and withdrew to his room. Later, when she'd looked in, he was up on his knees in the middle of his bed, looking out the window, or at the jars on his windowsill. And he was talking to himself. Or had she imagined that? "Seems about right." Mathers had a stethoscope to her son's bare chest. He then bent himself over and put his ear to where the stethoscope had been, as though eavesdropping through a keyhole. Straightening up, he penciled more notes into his small, tattered book. "8 last September, you say?" he asked. "That's right," said Margaret. Mathers slapped the book closed and stuffed it into a handbag which sat next to him on the floor. "Well," he said, looking Benjamin up and down, "as thin as a reed and pale as a sheet, that's plain to see, but fit right enough, far as I can tell." "Thanks be to God," said Margaret, crossing herself. The doctor struck Benjamin affably on the shoulder with the flat of his closed book, and the boy almost lost his balance. "Try and get some meat on his bones, more sun, a hot bath and a scrub now and then would do him good." "God bless you, Doctor, thank you." "Oh, no bother at all. Important our young ones grow up healthy and strong, right, lad?" Mathers struck Benjamin again, causing him to flinch. "Run along now, pet," said Margaret. "You've been very good." Benjamin pulled his shirt back on and scuttled off to his bedroom, closing the door behind him. "He's a shy one," Mathers said, his moustache lengthening across his face as he smiled. "Always has been," said Margaret. "Can't say I don't worry sometimes, though. It's torture just to get him to do his prayers." "Oh, I wouldn't worry, not at this stage. Sure, you know how boys his age get. Or perhaps you don't. He'll turn out grand. So he will, just grand. Be glad he's not some rascal running about destroying the place." The doctor chuckled hoarsely and then coughed into his sleeve. "Oh, bless you, Doctor. You've been very kind." Not a bother, said Mathers as he picked up his handbag. "Say, Margaret, I don't suppose you'd have a drop in the house now, would you?" The voice was not a voice, but that's how Benjamin thought of it at first. It was like a sense that he had lived his life without knowing he had. It was an unseen eye that finally opened, unbidden, inside his mind. He could not control it, for even though it was within him, it was not his. He could not silence it, for it made no sound. It spoke to him first in his sleep, and when he woke in the night from dreams that were not his own, it spoke to him then as well. He knew the voice belonged to the head, even though it did not come from the head, which sat on his windowsill. It came from his own. But when it spoke, the stone head pulsed with mutating colours that hurt Benjamin's eyes and mystified his brain. For they were not colours he, nor anyone else, had seen before. The voice filled him with impossible knowledge and answers to whatever question his thoughts could form. It closed his eyes and showed him things he was unable to imagine without its aid. Things more vivid and real than anything he had ever known. Landscapes and architecture and forms of life that even his child's mind knew were not of God's earth. And not only did he see these things, but he felt them and heard them and filled his nose with their scents. It all came to him cumulatively as sensations instantly implanted that were so wonderful and frightening that his body trembled as his mind reeled. And when finally it showed him what he could become and how, he needed to scream in horror and weep with joy. But he couldn't react in any way while the voice that was not a voice spoke to him, trapped as he was in agonized rapture. Benjamin returned to himself at the sound of his door creaking open. He turned and saw his mother's pale face appear, peering into the room. "Benji," she whispered. Benjamin said nothing. "You should be sleeping, my sweet," Margaret said, stepping into the room. "Who were you talking to?" Benjamin looked up at the head on his windowsill. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know he had been talking. He didn't want to tell his mother about the head he'd found in the ground, or of the things it had shown him. But it sat right there for her to see. He looked back to his mother, who came over from the doorway and knelt beside his bed. "Were you talking to your father?" she asked. Benjamin still didn't know what to say. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't know how to tell the truth. "Because that's all right," his mother said. "He can hear you, you know, when you talk to him." "How?" Benjamin found his own voice at last. "How can he hear me when I can't see him?" Genuine curiosity coloured his words. "We watched the men bury him in a box in the ground." Silence. Margaret shut her eyes against the stinging pain in her breast. "He can hear you because he's with God in heaven," she said, her voice toneless. "When we die, our bodies go into the ground, but our souls go up to heaven, where we can watch over the ones we love. You know that, Benjamin. I know you know that." Benjamin looked from his mother's face to the object on the windowsill. Her eyes followed his. "He's up there, son." She pointed to the night sky through the window. "And never doubt that he can see you. Never doubt that he can hear you when you speak to him." She leaned over and kissed her son's forehead, and drew a cross with her thumb on the spot she'd kissed. And then she left. Benjamin sat in bed, rigid with confusion. Had she not seen it? It was right there under the window she'd looked out of, right there looking back. How had she not seen it? He looked up at the head, afraid it might somehow have disappeared. It was still there, its slitted eyes looking back into his own. Margaret's concern deepened as the days crept by, and still Benjamin wouldn't come out from inside of himself. She recognized that it was not an illness, but then what? At least an illness could be diagnosed and cured. Surely it was company he needed. But it was still another month until school started up again, and anyway he'd never made close friends with the other boys. Nowadays he scarcely seemed to notice her. Maybe, she thought, he was finally coming to terms with his father's passing. She was taken aback at how well he'd dealt with it at the time, almost as though it didn't warrant a reaction. Probably he wasn't able to understand that he was gone forever, even after they'd buried him. Was he only now realizing the gravity of death? He said that he missed him, but she'd never seen him cry about it. He'd even asked Margaret why she needed to cry over him, because didn't she know he was in heaven? That always made her smile. What didn't make her smile was how he kept to his room lately. No digging in the garden, no interest in stories by the fire or walking in the nearby hills. He silently obeyed when she told him to eat or pray or bathe, or when she tasked him with his usual chores. But there was a clear reluctance to everything he did, as though he couldn't wait to get back to his room. She was tempted to call on Dr. Mathers again, but what would she say? That he's still quiet? That he doesn't want to spend time with her? No doctor could prescribe a cure for shyness. Mathers had looked at him and told her she shouldn't worry, but she found it hard to take his advice. And so she decided to wait. If it was the grief of mourning, then it would pass. If it was an illness the doctor had failed to detect, she could call on him again. All she could do in the meantime was watch over her son, be there for him, and wait for him to return to her. Night, and with it, the voice. Once again, Benjamin felt like he was postponing something that was about to happen, something he needed to do himself, but ultimately had no control over, a moment he could not avoid any more than he could avoid death. The voice had told him this, and the voice only spoke truth. And yet Benjamin felt he knew this truth long before he found the head, before the voice that did not speak ever spoke. It sat now as ever on the altar of his windowsill, like a relic whose purpose only he would ever recognize. He took it in his hands, and it permeated his body with a heat that was at once intense and barely perceptible. Benjamin knew the time approached when he began to feel the first pangs of a strange hunger. Somehow the object he held, which felt weightless and hollow, became irresistible. Inside him was a swallowing void that needed to be satiated. Benjamin could not wait any longer. Terrified though he was, he opened his mouth and bit into the face. The taste was ecstasy. As he swallowed, the void within him transformed into divine fire. He felt his body filled with a blinding brightness, as though his blood had become starlight. Again he bit into the head, and the brightness inside him intensified. He swallowed the second mouthful and felt his soul set ablaze. Then he gorged himself, ravenously tearing and swallowing until there was nothing left to swallow. And the perfection was unbearable. White light filled the room as the light inside him radiated. But Benjamin, blinded by bliss, hardly noticed. All he could perceive in that moment was the euphoric unity of his senses, and even though he knew what needed to happen next, there was nothing now that could prepare him for it. He felt a change inside him as the brightness diminished, jarring him back into reality, which was a hell compared to the paradise he'd so briefly touched. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was snatched away by the sudden movement of something else alive inside his body. Something that was trying to get out. all the light fled, and Benjamin was able to give voice to his agony. Margaret woke to the sound of her child screaming. She flew from her bed, her mother's mind turned primal. Benjamin's bed was empty. Silhouetted against the window was something impossible, something she could not identify. Even bent double, it was too tall to be a man, its head too long. Just now it seemed to be in the throes of deathly convulsions. Its long-limbed body writhed and twitched, its arms and legs jerked in sudden spasms. It looked like it was being born, issuing forth into the world from an invisible womb. Margaret's scream was deafening. Then the thing in the bedroom stopped and was perfectly still, as if subdued by the sound of Margaret's terror. Crouched underneath the window, its long, narrow head was bent downward. It opened its mouth and soundlessly vomited some spherical object into one of its hands, then placed it on the windowsill. It rose upright, its movements lithe, and looked at Margaret with black eyes that were mere slits in the front of its head. And through that look, with no words at all, it told her everything. It fixed her with its oil-black eyes, and Margaret could not move or speak or scream or think her own thoughts. All she could do under the spell of that gaze was understand the unbearable truth. And when its eyes broke from hers, she fell to the ground as if all the life inside her had been ripped from her body. Her sleep was black and dreamless. Daylight seeped weakly through the room's window when she woke. She was alone, crumpled on the cold wooden floor. Her head throbbed. She picked herself up and looked at Benjamin's empty bed. A pile of his clothes lay beside it. His father's rosary beads sat lonesome on the bedside table. She remembered what she found in the room in the night. Its eyes, its thoughts. But she was alone. Panic began to build hot in her chest. She screamed her son's name, if only to break the awful silence in the house. She went from room to room, screaming, searching. She looked for Benjamin as if he were something she'd misplaced. She ran into the garden, weeping, screaming. Then she remembered something else from her nightmare, and stopped. She returned to Benjamin's bedroom and saw it on the windowsill. It looked at first just like a weathered grey stone you'd find in the ground, but when she went to it and took it in her hands, her heart wanted to stop. It bore the face of her only son. Heaven Unearthed by Rory Say. If you would like to find out more about Mr. Say and his work, please visit our website, nocturnaltransmissions.com.au, and visit our featured authors section. We have a couple of new acolytes we would like to welcome into our weird little family. Eric B. Cooper and David H. Hunter. Welcome aboard, and thank you for your support. Speaking of which, this episode was brought to you with the generous assistance of our cohorts: Evan Dewley, Thomas Arvin, Michael Wood, Sam Bell, Robert Troy Peterson, and Sanitarium magazine. Sanitarium is an independent magazine dedicated to bringing audiences the best in horror from around the globe. Available from Amazon and sanitariumpublishing.com. If your business would like to become a cohort of Nocturnal Transmissions like our dear friends Sanitarium magazine, simply visit patreon.com/Nocturnal Transmissions. There's a link on our website. And sign up as an executive cohort. Your business will be mentioned every episode, and you will be proudly associated with a venture that brings unease and discomfort to thousands of terrified listeners every fortnight. Our humble narrator has insisted that I mention that if you are in the business of murdering dolphins, people trafficking, or other such nefarious activities, we reserve the right to decline your support. He's so sensitive sometimes. Perhaps squeamish would be a better word. Yes. I mean, whatever happened to the old adage, beggars can't be choosers? I don't believe he fully comprehends the precariousness of his position, but who am I to judge? All non-public domain stories are featured with the permission of the authors. All voices and production are concocted by Kristen Holland. Until next time, watch the skies, fear the dark, don't dig too deep, and of course, don't trust anyone. Especially yourself. Good night, gentle listener.